This week, I wanted to talk to you about the Sun-Saturn conjunction taking place in Aquarius on February 16th. Now, this Sun-Saturn conjunction is a pretty big deal. The reason why it's a pretty big deal is because it's the last time that Sun will be conjoining Saturn in the zodiac sign of Aquarius for another 28 years. Now, for some of you, you'll be going, huzzah, celebration, yay, Saturn's finally leaving the zodiac sign of Aquarius, and then for others of you, you'll be like, oh no, but it will be entering the zodiac sign of Pisces. I'm the next one under the gun.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Astrology Hub's Academy. Wherever you are on your astrology journey, we have a class that will help you get to the next level.
Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. I wanted today's talk to pretty much center around Saturn. Why is it that we're always full of dread whenever we talk about Saturn? Why is it when the subject of Saturn comes up, there's always a mixed response of like, oh no, don't talk about it, and also like, I wonder what's going to happen. What is it about Saturn that attracts both our fear and our love of danger? Okay, and most of this is pretty much wrapped up in the fact that Saturn, of all the planets in astrology, Saturn is perhaps the planet that is most like what we would come to understand as being the tragic hero. But let me get to that in just a moment. Before I begin to tell you about the story and the history of Saturn and what this final conjunction in Aquarius is going to mean, I wanted to share with you a little anecdote from my own life. This story takes place when I was probably about 13. So here I am, I'm 13 years old, and I'm standing in the laundry room next to my mother. It's probably a Saturday morning, and it was probably about late spring. The sun was streaming through the window, and she was folding clothes and putting them and piling them up in piles. There were a lot of clothes to fold, and there were a lot of piles to build, seeing as she had 5 sons. I was raised with 4 brothers, and we were all about a year apart. So here I was visiting with her in the laundry room early Saturday morning as she's folding laundry and getting ready to make the rounds to each of the bedrooms and distribute them on each of our beds. And I'm sure I was talking about something that I thought was important, but honestly, I can't really remember what it was. But I was talking about something. And knowing me at the age of 13, I was probably either rhapsodizing about something, or I was complaining about something. In any case, I'm sure it involved lots of eye rolling and sighs of disgust and some sort of subject that was going on and on and on about the heavy trials and tribulations I had to endure at the age of 13. And my mother was listening good-humoredly and quietly. And at one point, as she was folding the clothes and I was going on and on and on about myself, she turned and she looked at me and she said, Chrissy, how old are you? And I said, 13. And she responded thoughtfully, 13. And I responded, why? And she said, well, I think we'll be talking again when you're 21. And I remember saying, what's that supposed to mean? Now, at the time, I was so outraged that she had said something like that. It was so condescending. There was something so insulting about it. We'll talk again when you're 21, 8 years away from the age that I was right now. And I was horrified that she should say something like that to me. And it had nothing to do with, falling in mom's estimation or not having her approval or anything like that. I knew full well what she was telling me. She was telling me in her own very subtle way that you are obnoxious. All right. So, and my response, of course, was to be like, what's that supposed to mean? And I remember being so very, very upset. And I went to my room, and of course, to think about it, and of course, it never even dawned on me that maybe I might want to help my mother fold the laundry and continue this conversation. No, I was so involved in myself that I went to my room to sort of think about it and to be upset while she continued dutifully folding laundry by herself. I share with you that story because I remember at that time, well, the outrage and the embarrassment, but I also remember at that time that she had said something that was very true. She had said something that was very true about both of us and our relationship. We were no longer on the same page. I mean, there was a time earlier in my childhood in which, oh my goodness, I mean, it felt like I spent hours. I'm sure it was just like 20 minutes or something like that. But, where I would draw pictures and while my mom did the dishes or something like that, and she would look over my shoulder and give me, tips and things like that about how to flesh out a figure or to add some kind of color to it. And we would spend hours drawing, or she would play the piano and sing, or one of my favorite memories is actually flipping through art books. These were things that I shared with her, and she didn't really share with my other four brothers because they were all football players or baseball players or some sort of like maybe there was like lacrosse or something involved. Anyway, but it's something that we got to share, and we got to share because we both enjoyed these things. But when she said this to me, and when I responded the way that I responded and went off to my room in a huff, what it really underscored to me was that time in our lives, that time in our relationship had changed, and it wasn't going to come back again. Now, obviously, I didn't say that at 13. The years of my childhood have changed and they're never going to come back again. No, I mean, I would have had I thought of it, but no, it was more like this kind of heaviness and a kind of sorrow, actually. And I remember that because it was at the beginning of my adolescence, really. I was 13, and as more and more years passed, I remember everything was wrong. She couldn't do anything right. I rolled my eyes constantly. I think at some point I referred to my mom and dad as the parental unit. I mean, just really obnoxious stuff, but stuff that you have to do when you're an adolescent. It's just I don't know whether it's programmed to the body or the psyche or the throwing off of childhood or something like that, but it's just something that we all do. But when you're 13, you're experiencing it for the first time. And so when you're 13, you think that you're experiencing it for the only time. And this is the time that matters. And that's what I sort of wanted to talk to you today about the planet Saturn. Saturn is named after the Roman god of time. Saturn is his Roman name, but his Greek name, which comes much earlier, is Chronos, which means time. And it's also where we get the word chronic, okay, meaning kind of lasting a long time or something you have to live with for all of your life, or something that's not going to change, and there it is. Okay, so Saturn was named after the god of time. And in astrology, we come to understand Saturn as being the planet of tests, trials, and tribulations. Saturn's the great spoiler planet. Whenever it comes along by transit into your chart, you know that you're going to be having a difficult time in the area of life or the part of your chart that it happens to be transiting through. So we're always like, have to brace for this, or, forget about the next 2 years that Saturn's going through this sign, or there's always this feeling of like groan, oh, Saturn, and all the difficulties I'm going to have to endure. And then on a good day, you might say, well, Saturn is a teacher and Saturn teaches us lessons that we need to master. And it's kind of about karma and, the things you sort of say to yourself when you're going through a bad spell. But the thing is, Saturn brings these tests, it brings these trials, it brings these tribulations. This is basically its assignment in astrology. This is what it's in charge of. But I thought it might be a good idea to get a clearer understanding of what this is about with Saturn. In other words, to sort of develop some kind of sympathy for Saturn and why this is associated to him. The story of Saturn is the story of old versus young. All right. We're all pretty much familiar with these generational comments these days. And some of them are pretty hostile, that are sort of targeted right at the boomers, where younger people say, okay, boomer, or like, bye, boomer, and basically, old person, and you don't get it. And, you're such a burden, and you're squeezing the life out of the young and the restless and people who are coming to their maturity. So but this feeling of being the target of resentment from the younger generation, or the younger generation resenting the older generation, this is centuries old. This goes back as long as at least civilization is, and certainly in the animal kingdom. This kind of overthrowing of the old guard in order to establish something new, and something new is something fresh and aspirational, and a whole different take on the way that things are going to be from now on. So this is embodied in the Saturn story, the Saturn myth in Greek mythology. And it starts with basically the beginning of the world. In the beginning of the world, there were two deities. There was Uranus, Uranus, and there was Gaia. Okay, Uranus, Uranus was associated to heavenly sky, the sky full of stars, and Gaia was the earth. And Gaia, the earth, looked up to Uranus, the stars, and reflected in her eyes were starry eyes. So she was starry-eyed with love for Uranus, and Uranus sort of came into her as the perfect celestial lover and made love to her, and they made love all the time, 24/7. They were like teenage kids in the back of a car or something along those lines. We used to say teenage kids in the back of a 57 Chevy, but I'm sure things like that have changed nowadays. But anyway, they went at it, hot and heavy, Gaia and Uranus together. And as they made love, as they copulated, which is what we say in more polite circles, in other circles we say stirbt. But anyway, as they copulated, as they commingled their energies, Gaia began to give birth to children. And at first she gave birth to the Titans. She gave birth to the sun. She gave birth to the moon. She gave birth to these splendid creatures, a mix between the terrestrial and the celestial. And Uranus was like, oh, these are beautiful. These are beautiful. These are lovely creatures. I adore them. And Gaia was like, oh, if you adore them so much, come make love to me some more. And he's like, yes, like I would ever protest. I have to make love to you. And so they went and they made love more and more. And all of us, there were zebras, there were lions, there were fish, there were eagles, there were birds. All these creatures came out of Gaia, and they came and they filled the earth, and they even filled the heavens with their love, until one day Gaia gave birth to a one-eyed cyclops. Okay, and Uranus is like, what's that? And she's like, it's your child. It's a one-eyed cyclops. And he's like, that is the most hideous thing. That is the ugliest thing I have ever seen in my entire life. And she's like, well, it's still your child. You should love it just like everybody else. And he's like, ugh. And so, but I can't resist you. So they go back to making love. And then she gives birth to more and more creatures that are elegant and lovely and pleasurable to Uranus's eyes. But then she also begins giving birth to creatures that are, shall we call, lesser thans. And these are sort of like 100-armed giants with really ferocious BO, women with snake bodies and silic eyes and teeth and fangs, the things that Uranus began to find more and more reprehensible, things that limped, things that didn't have any limbs, or things that had some sort of fault. They weren't up to his celestial standards. And so he said, at one point he said, I don't know if I can make love to you anymore. She's like, well, why not? And he said, I don't know if I can make love to you anymore because you're having these really ugly children. And like, I feel like every time we come together, we have like ugly children, and they're just really distasteful to my better senses. And she's like, well, let's talk about that. What do you think we can do? And he said, well, is there any way that we can take the ugly ones, the stinky ones, the smelly ones? And is there any way we can sort of like put them back up inside of you again? And she's like, excuse me, and he's like, well, I was thinking we could just take them and put them back up inside of you again. Now we have to remember that these are gods and goddesses, and for some reason they can do things like this that we human beings cannot do or wouldn't even think of doing. But anyway, she's like, I guess, okay, and so he took the reprehensible, the ugly creatures, and he put them back up inside the womb of Gaia. He buried them, essentially. He put them underground. And so Gaia at first was accommodating, but after a while, this caused her great pain. This caused her great stress. This caused her great anxiety, as you can sort of imagine. And finally, she turned to her children, and who were imprisoned inside. She spoke to them. She spoke to them at night, and she said, I need one of you to do me a favor. And they're all like, what is it, Mother? What is it? We want to be liberated. We want to see the day. We want to see the sunlight again. We shall do whatever we can to liberate ourselves and to protect and honor you. And she's like, well, I need one of you to take this sickle, and a sickle is a half moon blade with a handle. I want one of you to take this sickle and to lie in wait at night for your father to come to make love to me. And when he's about to make love to me, I want one of you to spring forward and cut off his testicles. And they're like, tall order. So they're like, is there any way we can sort of discuss this amongst ourselves? And she's like, no, I need your answer right away. Which one of you will go and castrate your father and rescue your mother from this dire peril? And they're like, And of course, the one who steps forward in a very dark gloom says, I will. And the person who stepped forward in a dark gloom and said, I will, was Saturn. So Saturn left his mother and went out under the darkness of night and hid in the bushes, and he waited for his father to arrive again in all of his celestial glamour and glory. And when his father began to make love to his mother, he took his father's testicles and he whacked them off with the scythe. Okay, his father let out an extraordinary groan, and Saturn took his father's testicles and he threw them like a frisbee that flew through the sky. His testicles went flying through the sky, and they landed in the Mediterranean Ocean with a tremendous splash of water. And so out of this splash of water, these sinking testicles came spurting blood and semen in fountains, and out of the blood and semen that came spurting out of these testicles emerged Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Because in Greek mythology, there is always a call and response for every action. For every action, there is a reaction. So if Saturn was cutting something off, then Aphrodite emerges to bring it back together again. Okay, but that's a story for another time. But that is, by the way, the birth of Aphrodite. Now, to continue with this story and why it pertains to us astrologically, is Saturn gets between his mother and his father, and he pushes them apart. He pushes apart Earth from sky, okay? And he inhabits the middle. He inhabits that open, that empty space, okay, between Earth and sky. And the empty space that he inhabits is called time. Saturn brings time into the world. Before the castration of Uranus, we had eternity. But now, with the castration of Uranus and the separation of Gaia, the mortal coil, from heaven, the realm of eternity is time. This is where time exists, okay? And this is the realm of Saturn. So Saturn separates eternity from our day-to-day lives, and immediately time begins, okay? Creatures that used to live forever all of a sudden grow old and die. And this seems to be continuing. And Saturn's kind of like, well, what's going on? And Gaia's like, well, you have liberated me, which is wonderful, but you have also unleashed time. And he's like, well, what's that about? And she's like, my dear, everything right now has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And he's like, beginning, middle, end. It took Saturn a little bit to sort of like wrap his mind around this. And she's like, yes, everything is young. It's going to grow older. It's going to reach maturation. Then it's going to pass away. And that's going to give room for the new generation to come up and replace the old. And he's like, just like that? And she's like, just like that. That's the way time moves now. That's the way life works. And he's like, well, okay. And I guess I'm supposed to rule over this, right? Because Saturn had overthrown his father, and now he was stepping into rulership of the world and the universe. And she said, yes, of course, you rule over all of this right now, Saturn. And he's like, well, that sounds like a good thing. And she said, for a while. And he's like, for a while. And she said, well, because what's going to happen, Saturn, is that you're going to grow old and you're going to have children, and your children are going to come along and they're going to basically do to you what you did to your father. He's like, come again? And she said, they're going to come along. They're going to need to grow, Saturn, and they're going to have to overthrow you. They're going to have to overthrow you in order for life to proceed. So basically, let's get about the business right now, Saturn, of having children. And you need to have these children and they need to come of age. And then you need to be overthrown or retire gracefully, maybe to Florida, if that's your inclination. And Saturn's like, well, what if I don't want that to happen? What if I don't want to be overthrown? I thought what I did was right. I overthrew a tyrant, someone who was dominating you sexually. He was bad, and I'm not that. I wanted to bring law and order to all of this. And she's like, no, it doesn't work like that. You've now started the wheels of time, and the wheels of time will not cease. And he's like, oh. So Saturn marries. He has a wife named Rhea, and he makes love to Rhea, and Rhea starts to have children. And Saturn is like watching these children emerge from Rhea, and all he's thinking about is his doom, that he's getting nearer and nearer the time when these children, as each child appears, is going to grow older and overthrow him, and that will be the end of him. So Saturn, being a planet of planning, being a planet of time, looks at each child as it is born from his wife, a time of great celebration, and he asks his wife to pass him the child. And so Rhea says, well, yes, here's Hades. Isn't he handsome? He looks just like you. And so he looks down at Hades, and he takes Hades and he swallows him just like that. Okay. And as Rhea begins to have more and more children, more and more rapidly, there's Neptune, there's Hera, there's Hestia, there's Ceres. He throws each one of them down his throat. He swallows each and every one of them. Think of Lucy and Ethel at the chocolate factory when they have to wrap each of the chocolates, and then the conveyor belt starts speeding up, and Lucy grabs the chocolates and she begins to put them in her hat, and it won't hold, and then she starts gulping them down because they're trying to keep up with wrapping every one of the individual chocolates. This is exactly what's going on with Saturn and his children. He plops each one of them down as each one is born. And so Rhea is becoming more and more aghast and traumatized with this. There's a lot of trauma that goes on in Greek mythology. And so she's giving birth to the youngest child, but this one she decides to secret away. She calls two aides to her, and she wraps up the child in swaddling clothes. And she says, take this child away to an island in the Mediterranean and hide him until he comes of age. And they're like, we're on it, Rhea. And so they do. They take the youngest child, Zeus, and they go to an island in the Mediterranean, and they hide him there, and he's suckled by a great goat. But back here, Rhea is like, okay, he's expecting a child. He saw that I was pregnant, Saturn, so I have to do something. So she takes a great boulder and she wraps it up in baby clothes, and she gives it to Saturn, and Saturn swallows it, just like Lucy did on that Lucy and Ethel episode of the Chocolate Factory. And so he's there, and he's rather contented. He sort of lets out a healthy burp, and he's contented, and he has now put off his eventual overthrow. We know this image pretty much from the Goya painting, which is rather hideous, which shows Saturn almost like, eating away his child like it's a piece of chicken or something like that. It's a hideous, like fascinating and fabulous painting. But in reality, what happens is, of course, the gods are immortal. And so each of the children come to subside in a timeless place. And this timeless place is in the belly of the god. Okay. And the belly of the god that they subside in is the belly of Saturn. And that's where they subside, and that's where they wait. That's where they wait to be rescued. Some people say that this was a dark time, and some people say that this was a good time. The Romans, in fact, attributed to this as being the golden age, when time stood still and people no longer had to worry about conflict and wars and things of that sort. But there comes a time when Zeus comes of age, and Zeus does come of age, and he's a virile fellow in a toga, and he's got the power of lightning bolts, and he's ready to take on Dad. Okay, so Zeus decides to take on Dad, but before he can take on Dad, he's going to need allies, and his allies are his brothers and his sisters, whom Saturn has consumed. And I think it's, if memory serves me correctly, it's Pluto, it's Neptune, it's Ceres, it's Hestia, and it's Hera. Those are the 5 kids that went down Saturn's throat. Okay, so what Zeus does is that he concocts, or gets someone to concoct, some sort of I don't know if it's a diuretic or it's something that makes him throw up. Anyway, it makes Saturn very nauseous, and he throws up the children, and they come skidding out. I mean, Greek mythology gets so visceral. They come skidding out in the vomit, and they arise, and Zeus says, "To my side." And somehow they're like adults, and Zeus is brandishing his thunderbolt, and there's a war in heaven. It's a very famous war in heaven, and it's a war in heaven in which the echoes of the thundering and the clashing go on and have been told and retold over the centuries again and again and again. The winner of this war in heaven is Zeus. Zeus, as his mother had prophesied, succeeds in overthrowing his father Saturn. Okay, and in beating back the Titans who had all come to Saturn's aid. And one of them, Prometheus, even switched sides and came over to Zeus's side to help overthrow Saturn and his brethren. Okay, so Zeus overthrows them, and so then becomes the problem of, what do you do with the old guy? Okay, because Saturn is a god, so you can't kill him. Do you exile him? Do you imprison him? And do you castrate him? I mean, even in, I think it's some sort of Italian literature, there's Zeus himself turns around and castrates Saturn, just like Saturn had castrated his father. I think Sigmund Freud got all of his source material here. But anyway, so Zeus has now created his own age, which is the Silver Age, and so he's going to go forward into the world, and he's going to rule, and he becomes the dominant figure, and indeed that is what he becomes. So again, it's never really quite described what happened to Saturn. Some say that he was buried in the bowels of the earth and put into a slumber. Others said he went down to a special place in the south where there were beautiful zephyr winds and lovely beaches. Again, it sounds like Florida or something like that. Who knew that there was an archetypal reason for Florida? But anyway, but the Romans actually said that Saturn traveled among people. That Saturn traveled among people. He traveled among the Romans, and he was a god that showed mankind how to work the earth. Okay, so actually Saturn was attributed as bringing civilization, or at least teaching mankind how to fend for themselves in a world where everything grew old and died. Okay, so how do you farm? How do you make the most of your resources? These were the things that Saturn taught. And Saturn's emblem, of course, is the small case H with the cross. And the other person who taught mankind how to farm and how to make the most of agriculture and feed themselves is Ceres, Saturn's daughter. And if you look at the symbol of Ceres, one is the upside down side, and the other one is the upside up side. Okay, so both Saturn and Ceres were associated with agriculture. And both the planet and the asteroid are connected to the idea of teaching you how to live in this world. This is kind of the assignment of the two. But let's get back to the dilemma of Saturn. It's ironic that for a god that's associated with time, that we see an out of time or out of sync quality go on in the three parts of this story. In the first part of the story, we see a young god who's given the terrific responsibility of overthrowing the old order, of overthrowing his father. And Saturn still contains and carries that rebellious side to him. That's actually, if you look at the iconography of Saturn, that's very much associated with Saturn. Saturn was always connected to the idea of revolt. And of course, who were the people who were revolting but the farmers and the peasants that Saturn was the patron god of in the medieval period. So Saturn, on one hand, is the person who leads the revolt, but like an Oedipus or like a Hamlet, isn't aware of what the consequences of this action is. He thought he was doing the heroic thing, only to realize that there is a web of consequences to his action that are taking him down a very bad road. And so this really introduces the tragic figure. Our first encounter with the tragic figure is really Saturn in this story. Then, so here we have someone who's overthrown, and who, is saying, my time has come, and he steps into that time only to be told himself that his time is already fleeting and passing, and that he will in turn be overthrown as well. Then we have the middle period where the children are swallowed, where time is at a standstill. And this, of course, is the postponement, the delay that is often attributed to a Saturn transit. How things, that you thought were going to be quickly settled go on for twice as long, 3 times as long, 4 times as long. Ask any Aquarian about the last 2.5 years, and they'll tell you, I can't believe that I was dealing with this again, or how long this took to go on. This is another attribute of Saturn. This is the swallowing of the children. So it's things plateauing or at a standstill or time stopping. And then we have the third part of the story where Saturn, believing in good faith that he had stopped the clock and that he was bringing this peaceful golden reign, at least he was convinced it was good, and a lot of writers at the time say it was pretty good, finds himself challenged by a young son, and overthrown. So it's like, no sooner does he get to this time where he can, establish peace and prosperity, then he himself is facing being overthrown, and he fights to hold on to this, and he is overthrown and sent into the world as an exile. And that theme of exile, we'll return to that in future talks a lot when we talk about Saturn, especially in Pisces, is a very, very powerful, very, very powerful theme. And it also shows up, Saturn in Aquarius, with the Aquarian character, how Aquarians can suffer from the irony of wanting to be a part of a group that they never feel like they're a part of. There's always a sense of ostracism or not fitting in, or even exile. These are the themes of Saturn, and they're very, very potent and important to Saturn. But how this comes together now with Saturn coming to the end of its stay in Aquarius, and really with the modern planets getting ready to change signs this year and next, what you're really seeing and what we hear a lot about is this conflict between the generations. If you put on the news and things like that, it's like, what are we doing with a septuagenarian president? Why are these people who are in Congress, what are they still doing here? Why don't they give way to the younger people? This is something that we see in America, and why don't the old folks just step aside and let the young people come forward? Why are they stifling growth? Why are they blocking growth? And here we see Saturn as the old guy, the old man, okay, God, who has swallowed the children and has stopped time, or is refusing to budge, is refusing to give up place on the throne gracefully. And so we have a terrific conflict that's going on between the generations right now, where younger people are feeling like, I feel like I'm standing by and watching you ruin this planet because you refuse to believe in climate change. I feel like I'm being held back by this older generation and being made to sit through the repetition of racial injustice, of oppression, of BIPOC people, of just, just the destruction of the planet, the oppression of people, and literally, guns being taken to school and killing children. I mean, that phrase, time swallows its own children. I mean, this is going on. These old ideas, these old fears, these old anxieties, not only are keeping, people in place who are perhaps out of touch or outdated, but it's continuing a cycle of violence and oppression that seems to be growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And so you can hear younger people like calling out and saying, get out of the way and let us who are inheriting the planet and who have to live in the future stop ruining our future, stop bankrupting our future. Okay. And so, we have a generation, a very Jupiterian generation, that's saying one side, and give me back, my people, and get out of the way, and you're not running the world right. A younger side that's saying we must inherit, that's our natural prerogative, that's what happens. And then you have an older generation that's convinced you're not ready. You're not able to do this. You're too impulsive. You're too crazed. And you can sort of see evidence in that with some of the younger people, particularly in government, who just want to smash everything and tear down the way that things used to be done, with no replacement, with no vision of what the future is supposed to be. Okay, so you really have this impasse, and you really have this clash that's going on right now. And so what it makes me think of, it actually does take me back to my 13-year-old self. And it makes me think that we can't know what it's like to inhabit somebody else's time. All right. We think of it as like, well, I can't really know what it's like to live your life in your body or in your socioeconomic circumstances, or with the kind of challenges you face, or your background, or your culture, or your history. I don't really know what that's like. So we know that idea, right? But here's an idea of, we can't know what it's like to inhabit somebody else's time. When my mom turned to me and said, let's talk again in 8 years, okay, she knew that there would be a time in my maturation that I would reach that would make me reasonable and probably bearable again. I think she was being a little generous at the age of 21. I probably needed a few years after that. But anyway, what do you want? This was the first thing that came to mind. But she had an ability, because she was older than me, to see a time when we would be on the other side of this, and we would be able to pal around again, or we would find our way back to each other again. She was able to see that, and she could see that because of her age, and she's a parent, and probably because she went through something similar with her own mother. Okay. But me at 13, I couldn't see that. That was unimaginable. That was unimaginable. What she had done is that she was being mean, and she was being awful to me, and I felt bad and hurt, and I had to go to my room and think about it. So she had hurt me, and so all I was thinking about was the hurt and the indignance and the outrage. I couldn't possibly imagine myself 8 years older. One doesn't. One is 13, for the most part. And that's kind of what happens with each of our times. We can't really imagine what it's going to be like in the future because we're dealing with, whether Biff likes me or getting my driver's license, or am I getting into school, or what am I going to do for a living right now? Or, I've got to, pay the bills because I've got a baby. We're dealing with time at our time. Okay. And it's very hard to project into the future or to really understand somebody else's time or where somebody else is at that time. And this happens a lot. And I even remember it, just sort of like, kvetching, complaining about a boss and how they could never really understand these things and stuff like that. And it would be different if I were in charge or when I come to that place in my life where I have these responsibilities. And, but I didn't know at that age what that was really going to be like. It's complete speculation. It's complete projection. And this is what time does. It keeps us in our place. And that's one of the reasons why Saturn is the planet of limits and limitations. Oftentimes we hear the limitations when we think about the test, trials, and tribulations, but Saturn keeps us in place. Okay, that's part of what it does. Older people know what it's like to be young. Okay, many of them still feel young in bodies, even though the body isn't acting that way. Okay, but older people do know what it's like to be young, but at the same time, they don't. They don't because their past isn't today's present. Okay, so even though an old person can actually even feel what they felt when they were younger. Memory is not, stuck in one thing, like a Tennessee Williams play or something like that. But the past that an older person is referencing isn't the present that a young person is experiencing. And young people also on their side, they want older people to be the parents. They want older people to be the authority. On one hand, they want someone to look up to. And on another hand, it's much more delicious to rail against them and throw things at them and say, bye boomer, and give them a hard time and rebel. When you're young, you want something to rebel against. It's important. So there's this breakdown in communication that takes place with the generations. The way that time works is that it's only when you come into a position of responsibility. Let's say you're a younger person. It's only when you come into a position of responsibility and have to make the tough choices that people in authority have to make. That's the time when you get it. That's the time when you're like, oh, that's why they did what they did. That's what it's like to be in this position, to make the tough choices that a person in a position of responsibility has to make. But by that time, when you come into that position of responsibility and have to start making the tough choices, you're no longer young. And you're older. Okay, you're no longer young, and you're already living with the prospect of there being another generation eyeing your spot on the totem pole. I remember Winona Ryder years ago. I think it was like maybe 5 years after she made the film Heathers. I'm dating myself here and proud of it. But anyway, it was about 5 years after she made the film Heathers. And she was a hot commodity in Hollywood. But she said in an interview that she remembered someone saying, it was like a repeated conversation from a casting director about a film that she was up for. Well, actually, we want someone who looks like Winona Ryder. Okay, so it was this idea of like, they no longer wanted Winona Ryder, they wanted the next Winona Ryder. And so that's something that, of course, it's a story from Hollywood, because Hollywood is like obsessed with age, and you see it battling all the time between the younger and the older generations of actors. But that's also an example of just like, wow, I'm just like 5 years on the other side of my hit, and they're already looking for a younger version of me. That's basically what she came out and said in the interview, and that always stayed with me. I was like, ooh, that's like really tough. Okay, so Now, of course, in the best scenario, the older generation mentors the younger generation and helps them to be the best that they can be. They mentor, which means they impart knowledge, but they don't get bossy, domineering, or egotistical about it. The whole point is to help nurture and to support the younger generation. And the younger generation, by being with the older generation, can hopefully refresh and restore old eyes and old hearts that have become set in their ways and stopped seeing and stopped listening a long time ago. That's something that we would have in a perfect world. But it doesn't always happen that way. And this is something, as evidenced by our recent Saturn-Uranus squares that we had in 2021, is very much on the table in terms of this kind of like takedown wrestling match that's going on between the older and the younger generation. It's really, really sharp right now. And it makes sense because we have Saturn leaving the last of the Saturn-ruled signs. Saturn has been in Saturn-ruled signs for about 6 years. And then we also have the modern planets changing their signs. So there's a big turning of the page that's taking place right now. Saturn's great gift. Saturn has a lot of great gifts, but Saturn's great gift is the intimate knowledge of life that only comes with living it. And I like that thought. Saturn's great gift is the intimate knowledge of life that comes with living it. All right. And it puts me in mind of a wonderful old African proverb that I heard once. And that proverb went, "When an elder dies, a library burns to the ground." Isn't that something? Think about it. When an elder dies, a library burns to the ground. That person's memories, the traditions that have been passed down, the knowledge, the wisdom that has been passed down. A library burns to the ground. It's sorrowful, but there's also sort of bittersweetness there, and there's also a beautiful regard for the elder generation. The fact that the fates of both the old and the young are so intricately bound and tied up in one another. In any case, these are things that I want you to think about as Saturn begins its transition into the zodiac sign of Pisces in March.
Did you know there's a whole universe that you can unlock with so-called minor aspects? Most astrologers don't even use them, but master astrologer Rick Levine calls them harmonic aspects, saying they're key to revealing the deeper, metaphysical dimension of a birth chart, including the creative, mystical, and unseen parts of ourselves and others. And if you want a taste of how powerful they can be, just listen to what he has to say about some of the subtiles in play during his February and March forecast.
There's one other thing that happens in February. By the 12th, Venus makes a septile. That's 1/7 of a circle to Pluto. Venus makes a septile to Uranus. Boom, boom. What are septiles? They're otherworldly. They're supernatural. Dane Rudhyar said they were fated. Things come out and things come through that were somehow in other realms. And like Uranus, it's like lightning striking. And I think the combination of Mercury going into Uranus's modern sign of Aquarius and all these septiles will awaken us to the idea that we don't see everything that we think we do. Of course, it's not lost on me that this is the first week of Foundations Level 3 course, and it's just such an overwhelming septile message that we get from the universe. I really think that there's going to be a bit of a wake up in mid-February.
If you're ready to uncover these powerful unseen aspects in your chart, join us for Astrology Foundations Level 3 with Master Astrologer Rick Levine at astrologyhub.com/foundations3.